Hey friends, tonight we're diving into something oddly familiar, royal drama. Not the noble, world-shaking kind you find in history books. No, we're talking about the petty, strange, and occasionally soap operatic nonsense that unfolded behind the velvet curtains of medieval palaces. Before you get too cozy, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this sleepy stroll through history. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always wonderful to see our little medieval sleep circle light up across time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's begin tonight's journey, not into battlefields or sieges, but into the dining halls, boudoirs, and scribbled family trees of kings and queens who really could use a therapist. Because if you think modern royals have drama, just wait until you hear about the Holy Roman Emperor who refused to take off his crown. Or the French king who thought he was made of glass. These aren't tragic tales. These are royal bloopers, history's bloated egos, and very fancy arguments about horses, socks, and who gets the bigger crown. Let's begin. Picture this. You've just won the medieval version of the Powerball. You're crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. People kneel when you pass. Monks write poetry about your jawline. You're on top of the world. And yet, for one emperor, that wasn't enough. He needed everyone to know he was important at every moment of every day. Even while asleep, even while bathing. That man was Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa, and he made it his personal mission never to be seen without his crown. Not just during official ceremonies. Not just at dinner. All the time. According to some accounts, Frederick even wore his heavy, bejeweled crown to bed. Now, medieval beds weren't exactly soft, more like a straw pancake. But imagine adding a 3-pound metal hat to the mix. Was it comfortable? Absolutely not. But was it imperial? Very. Why? Well, because in the 12th century, image was everything. Kings ruled by divine right. And the crown wasn't just jewelry. It was a symbol of God's blessing, like a shiny medieval Wi-Fi router for divine authority. Taking it off? That would be like admitting you were just a guy in tights who owed several barons money. But here's the twist. At one point, during a particularly solemn religious moment, Frederick was asked to remove his crown out of respect. He refused. He sat there glowing with gold leaf and ego, possibly sweating profusely, while everyone else knelt in prayer. He was God's anointed ruler, after all. Taking off the crown would mean admitting someone else might be in charge. And that, dear listener, was not the medieval vibe. Did this make him a better emperor? Absolutely not. Did it give him neck problems? Almost certainly. But did it set the tone for a long line of rulers confusing symbolism with wisdom? You bet. So if you've ever met someone who insists on wearing sunglasses indoors, just remember, they walk in the footsteps of Barbarossa. Next up, a French king with a very fragile ego and skeleton. Some monarchs believed they were descended from gods. Others thought they were chosen by divine right, anointed with sacred oils and big hats. And then there was King Charles VI of France, who believed, quite sincerely, that he was made of glass. Let that sink in. Not delicate like a flower or easily offended. No, actual, literal glass, like a vase, or a wine goblet, or a window that panics if someone slams a door too hard. Charles VI, also known to later generations as Charles the Mad, ruled France during one of its more turbulent centuries, which, for medieval France, is saying a lot. He came to the throne in 1380 at the tender age of 11, which is already a red flag. If you ever met an 11-year-old, you know they shouldn't be in charge of a lemonade stand, let alone a kingdom. Early on, things seemed fine. Charles was well-educated, athletic, reasonably charming. But by his mid-20s, something began to change. He suffered a mental break during a military expedition. One moment a proud king, the next attacking his own men, foaming at the mouth and forgetting who he was. It was the first of many episodes, and they only got stranger from there. He would forget his own name. He'd fail to recognize his wife and children. He'd talk to imaginary friends and whisper secrets to the walls. But the most peculiar and oddly poetic delusion was this. Charles believed that his body was made entirely of glass. He insisted on wearing specially reinforced clothing to protect his fragile frame. Thick layers of quilted fabric, sometimes even steel ribs sewn into his robes. He banned people from touching him without permission. At one point, he reportedly refused to sit down unless the chair had an extra cushion, for fear that his hips might shatter on contact. The royal court, of course, had to pretend this was all completely normal. Imagine being a noble in the 1390s. You're summoned to court, and there's the king, wrapped like a delicate teapot, glaring suspiciously at the chairs and asking if you happen to be carrying anything sharp. You nod, you bow, you agree. Yes, Your Majesty, glass bones are the worst. You just want to keep your land and avoid being executed for aggressive posture. Modern historians now believe Charles may have suffered from a form of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, possibly worsened by mercury treatments, stress, inbreeding, or just the constant horror of medieval dentistry. But to his subjects, it was terrifying. Their king, supposedly divinely appointed, was afraid of cracking like a church window in a hailstorm, and yet the kingdom went on. France stumbled through his reign, carried by advisors, family members, and scheming nobles. Charles would drift in and out of lucidity, sometimes lucid enough to hold court, other times convinced that demons were hiding in the firewood. The weirdest part? He wasn't alone. The glass delusion was, believe it or not, a thing in late medieval and Renaissance Europe. A handful of nobles and scholars developed similar beliefs that they might shatter if touched, bumped, or looked at too sternly. Apparently, being rich in the 15th century came with a surprising side effect: extreme emotional fragility. Centuries before the phrase snowflake became popular, Charles VI was out there living it, wrapped in cotton and fear, too nervous to sit down without cushioning. So the next time you feel a little anxious or oversensitive, remember Charles. At least you don't need to wear armor to hug your dog. Next up, a queen who vanished without a trace, leaving behind a crown, a kingdom, and one extremely confused king. Royal disappearances are rare. After all, kings and queens don't just wander off like a distracted tourist at a Renaissance fair. They have guards, servants, advisors, and at least 3 people watching them eat soup. But in the late 14th century, Queen Joanna of Naples did something very unqueenly. She disappeared, and not in the dramatic, murdered by court intrigue way. No, Joanna simply left, quietly, permanently, with very few answers. Let's rewind a bit. Joanna I of Naples, born in 1326, was no fragile flower. She was bold, well-read, and politically ruthless. By her early 20s, she'd outlived a husband, a scandal, and several revolts. She'd ruled Naples, fended off enemies, and even dabbled in papal politics, because nothing says multitasking like juggling a war and a church schism before breakfast. But ruling Naples was no picnic. It was a kingdom constantly under siege from mercenaries, rival claimants, and that one cousin everyone hated but who somehow kept showing up with an army. Joanna held it together for years, balancing diplomacy, inheritance disputes, and accusations that she may or may not have had her first husband murdered in a castle stairwell. You know, typical royal marriage stuff. Then came the big feud, the Western Schism. The Catholic Church, in a stunning display of unity, had 2 popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon. Joanna, in a bold move, supported the Avignon pope. This did not sit well with the Roman faction or with her cousin Charles of Durazzo, who used it as the perfect excuse to invade Naples and grab the throne for himself. By 1381, Joanna's support crumbled. Her allies bailed, her army faltered, and the doors of her castle were quite suddenly no longer locked from the inside. So what did Joanna do? She vanished. According to the most popular account, Charles stormed the fortress, captured Joanna, and had her quietly strangled and buried in a nameless grave. Very medieval, very grim. But other sources suggest something different, that Joanna escaped through a hidden passage, smuggled away by loyal supporters, that she fled Naples entirely, that she lived out her days as a nun or a peasant or a cloaked traveler who occasionally corrected monks on their Latin conjugations. No one knows for sure. Her body was never definitively found. Rumors popped up for years. Joanna's sightings in Spain, in Provence, even in the Holy Land. Like a medieval Elvis, she became legend. The vanished queen, the runaway ruler. A woman who ruled kingdoms, argued with popes, and then ghosted her entire monarchy. And perhaps that's what makes her story so strange. Not that she was overthrown. That happened often enough. Not that she died mysteriously, very on brand for the 14th century. But that a queen, used to palaces and politics, might have chosen something else entirely. Freedom. Because what's more rebellious than leaving behind a crown, a court, and a dozen squabbling bishops to take a long walk in the woods and never come back? Up next, a prince who became king of 2 countries but couldn't rule his own emotions or his pants. If you're going to give yourself a nickname, don't pick the bad. Unfortunately, Charles II of Navarre didn't get to choose his moniker. It was gifted to him by pretty much everyone he ever met. Chroniclers, kings, popes, poets, they all agreed. This man was trouble, and not the sexy, misunderstood kind. The petty, backstabbing, poison your dinner, and then blame the butler kind. Charles was born into French and Navarrese royalty in 1332. Technically, he ruled the small but strategically located kingdom of Navarre, nestled in the Pyrenees between France and Spain. But Charles had ambitions far larger than mountain borders. He wanted power, lots of it, preferably French-shaped. Now, medieval France was already juggling the 100 Years. War, a painfully long argument with England over who got the biggest throne and the most hats. Into this chaos stepped Charles, who positioned himself as an opportunistic wild card. He made alliances, broke them, made new ones, broke those too, like a medieval Tinder user, but with more swords. At various points, Charles sided with both France and England, sometimes in the same week. He was suspected of trying to assassinate the French king. He forged documents, sabotaged treaties, and may have orchestrated the poisoning of a few inconvenient nobles. He was, in every sense, exhausting. But for all his political backstabbing, it was his final act that truly sealed his legacy. And it had nothing to do with wars or thrones. It was his death, or rather, the outfit he wore while dying. By the 1380s, Charles was ill. Not send for the apothecary ill. More like get the priest ill. His legs were paralyzed, his body swollen, and his schemes finally running out. A local physician, perhaps overwhelmed or maybe just a little too creative, proposed a treatment that involved wrapping the king in linen cloths soaked in brandy, not dabbed, not gently applied, soaked. The goal? To stimulate the body and purify the humors. The reality? Charles II, a man soaked in flammable liquid, was sealed into this brandy-drenched linen suit and then left near a fire to warm through. Which is how, according to at least 2 chroniclers, a servant with a candle accidentally set the king ablaze. The resulting fireball was not quick. Charles burned for hours. His screams echoed through the palace halls. His physician allegedly fled the scene. The servant dropped the candle and pretended it was someone else's fault. And Charles the Bad, died in a blaze of accidental, undignified glory. If this sounds suspiciously poetic, well, some historians agree. There's debate about whether the story was exaggerated, fabricated, or simply too good not to repeat, but it stuck. For centuries, Charles was remembered not just as a scheming villain, but as the king who literally went up in flames because someone gave him flammable pajamas. And really, what's more medieval than that? A life spent plotting, lying, and betraying, only to be undone by brandy, linen, and an intern with poor candle awareness. Next, we meet a sultan who kept his brother locked in a gilded cage, just in case. Some rulers hand out titles, others hand out land. But Ottoman sultans? They handed out cages. Welcome to the world of cafes, or the cage, one of the most luxurious, anxiety-inducing, and morally questionable institutions in royal history. And at the center of it all stood Sultan Ahmed I, the man who, in the early 1600s, decided that imprisoning his brother was just good governance. Let's back up. The Ottoman Empire, for all its grandeur and architectural flair, had a teeny-tiny succession problem. Mainly, how do you decide which prince gets the throne when all of them think they should be sultan? Early solution, fratricide. Yep, kill your brothers. All of them. It sounds extreme, and it was, but it became the standard operating procedure. You became sultan, and then immediately ordered the execution of your male siblings. No hard feelings, just politics. But Sultan Ahmed I wasn't so sure. When he ascended the throne in 1603, he was only 13. He hadn't even grown a mustache yet. Killing his younger brother Mustafa, who was just a boy himself, felt excessive. So he tried something new. He spared Mustafa's life. Sort of. He ordered that Mustafa be placed in the cafes, a special section of the palace designed to keep royal brothers alive and out of the way. But this wasn't your standard dungeon. No rats, no chains, no moldy bread. This was a golden prison, literal rooms of marble, gardens, fine linens, and musicians. Mustafa had servants, silk robes, and the best food in the empire. He just couldn't leave, or speak to anyone, or make decisions, or show his face. He spent years there, watching the world pass by from behind gilded screens. And he wasn't the only one. The cafes became an institution, a kind of high-security royal nursery where spare princes were tucked away like unwanted heirlooms. Some lost their minds. Others became philosophers. A few plotted escape, quietly, under their breath, to the cushions. But the strangest part? After Ahmed died of typhus, Mustafa was pulled out of the cage and declared sultan. It went as well as you'd expect for a man who had spent his entire adult life in solitary luxury. Mustafa I, nicknamed Mustafa the Mad because Ottoman historians also had a flair for cruel honesty, ruled with the emotional stability of a cat in a thunderstorm. He muttered to himself. He gave orders that contradicted each other. He would randomly throw coins to servants and then panic because he thought the treasury was being robbed. He was removed, then restored, then removed again. Eventually, the cafes became the permanent solution for surplus princes. No more executions, just polite, lifelong house arrest in the empire's nicest oubliette. Some men lived there for decades. Born in gold, raised in silk, never knowing the outside world. Until, one day, a vizier tapped them on the shoulder and said, "Congratulations, you're sultan now. The empire's on fire. Good luck." Imagine being called to rule 25 million people after 40 years of playing chess against a marble floor. In a way, it's the most medieval paradox of all. Power was dangerous. But the possibility of power? That was deadly. Next, a Scottish king who really didn't trust his nobles and built the world's most paranoid castle. Some kings rule with strength, others rule with charm. James V of Scotland? He ruled with suspicious architectural decisions. Born in 1512, James V had what you might call trust issues. And to be fair, they were earned. His childhood was a carousel of betrayals, backstabbing nobles, and relatives who thought family bonding meant armed rebellion. His father died at the Battle of Flodden when James was just a baby, leaving the toddler technically in charge of a deeply unstable kingdom full of men who thought, sure, but what if I were king instead? By his teens, James had already been used as a political pawn, hidden, manipulated, and forced into early lessons in surviving dinner without being poisoned. When he finally took full control of Scotland in the 1530s, he had one priority: never let anyone stab him, ever. And so he built a castle. But not just any castle. Welcome to Falkland Palace, the royal retreat where medieval paranoia became interior design. At first glance, Falkland is beautiful, with manicured gardens, ornate towers, and sweeping views of the Scottish hills. But take a closer look, and you'll spot the signs. Windows positioned to see every angle of approach. Hidden escape passages. Spiral staircases that twist in a specific direction, so right-handed attackers are at a disadvantage. And, most famously, James's personal quarters were built like a fortified bunker, high above ground level, accessible only through a single narrow stair, with walls thick enough to withstand a small siege and a fireplace so deep you could probably hide a cousin inside it. He also insisted on secret doors, false walls, and architectural tricks that allowed him to eavesdrop on guests. One chamber reportedly had a vent that let him listen to conversations in the room below. In another, a disguised latch opened directly into the rafters, presumably for those moments when the royal dinner party got too intense. Now, did James need all this? Well, yes and no. Scotland in the 16th century was a hotbed of noble feuds, English meddling, and general existential dread. James was frequently betrayed. He was the target of conspiracies, but his solution, transforming a Renaissance palace into a medieval spy bunker, was unique. Even his bedroom had escape routes. That's not metaphorical. His bedroom had a back door that led to a hidden stair, which led to a concealed stable, which led to a forest path. So if someone knocked on his chamber door in the middle of the night with an axe and a grudge, James could already be halfway to the Highlands. And he used those routes. Multiple times. He vanished in the middle of the night, leaving courtiers scratching their heads over half-eaten venison and a king-shaped hole in the drapes. But here's the twist. For all his paranoia, James was actually quite popular. He invested in infrastructure, reined in corrupt lords, and promoted justice. Or at least, justice that didn't involve him getting murdered. He also had a deep love of music, poetry, and falconry, which meant his secret fortress often echoed with the sound of harps, birds, and anxious whispering. In the end, James's careful planning couldn't save him from what got most medieval rulers: a bad decision. He launched a disastrous campaign against England, lost a major battle, and died shortly after, allegedly from despair. Or maybe it was just the stress of sleeping with one eye open for 30 years. Either way, his fortress of fear remains. Falkland Palace still stands, a monument to the beautiful anxiety of kingship. Because when you live on a throne made of other people's grudges, you learn very quickly, trust no one, and always know where the back door is. Next up, a king who refused to cut his hair and started a 3-year war about it. History is full of wars. Some are fought over land, others over religion, power, or dynasties. But once, and yes, this actually happened, a war began because a king didn't want a haircut. Let's meet King Louis VII of France. also known to historians as that one guy who really took his monk phase too seriously. Louis became king in 1137 when he was just a gangly, shy teenager. Unlike other rulers who were raised on tales of conquest and ambition, Louis was originally meant to be a monk. He'd been trained in theology, wore plain robes, and probably smelled faintly of parchment and incense. But when his older brother died unexpectedly, little Louis was plucked from the monastery and plopped onto the throne. And let's just say, he never quite stopped being a monk in a crown. He prayed obsessively, fasted dramatically, and wore a hair shirt under his robes. For humility and rash management. But there was one thing he refused to do, no matter how kingly people insisted: cut his hair. Now, to you or me, this sounds charming. A medieval Rapunzel situation. Maybe a royal mullet. But to the French court, it was a full-blown scandal. You see, in the 12th century, hair was political. Kings were expected to look the part, groomed, majestic, practically glowing with divine authority. Long, unkempt monk hair suggested weakness, indecision, or worst of all, piety. And nothing makes barons nervous like a king who would rather chant psalms than attend war council. Louis's refusal to cut his hair symbolized everything the French nobility feared: a king more interested in theology than territory. And this became a real problem when Louis married Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most glamorous, powerful, and frankly bored women in medieval Europe. Eleanor was sharp, worldly, and entirely unimpressed with her new husband's monk-chic aesthetic. She came from a court of poetry, music, falconry, and drama. And suddenly she was married to a man who spent evenings debating scripture and brushing his split ends. The cracks began early. Louis would go on pilgrimage. Eleanor wanted to go hunting. He would attend mass. She would host troubadours. He would refuse to bathe, citing religious modesty. She would remind him gently, and then less gently, that kings don't smell like goats. But the real split came during the Second Crusade, when both Louis and Eleanor traveled to the Holy Land. It was a disaster. Not just the military part, although yes, that too, but the vibe. Louis led like a monk. Eleanor acted like a queen. She even allegedly flirted with her uncle, yes, that uncle, sparking a royal scandal. When they returned to France, they were done. The marriage was annulled. The reason? Consanguinity, which is a fancy medieval way of saying we're too closely related, even though that had somehow escaped everyone's notice during the multi-year engagement and crown exchange. But here's the kicker. Eleanor then married Henry Plantagenet, soon to be Henry II of England. Suddenly, her vast lands in Aquitaine, which had once belonged to France, now belonged to the English crown. Louis lost half his kingdom over a haircut, a bad marriage, and a deeply unfortunate personality clash. And the result? A bitter rivalry between the French and English that would spiral into decades of warfare, rebellions, and the eventual 100 Years' War. All because one king said, "No thanks, I'm keeping the monk hair," and one queen said, "No thanks, I'm marrying your rival," and giving him all of southwestern France. Which just goes to show, in royal politics, it's never just about the hair. It's about the head it sits on. Next up, a pope with a grudge so deep he put a corpse on trial. You've probably heard that medieval Europe took religion seriously, but you may not know that once a pope got so angry, so bitter, and so wildly petty that he dug up a dead pope just to put him on trial. Yes, this is the story of Pope Formosus, Pope Stephen VI, and the most dramatic courtroom drama of the 9th century, the Cadaver Synod. Let's set the scene. The late 800s were not a stable time for the papacy. Popes came and went like seasonal staff. Alliances shifted weekly. Nobles installed popes like chess pieces, and emperors used Rome as their personal theological playground. In the middle of this chaos was Formosus, a bishop who rose to become pope in 891. Formosus had enemies. Specifically, he'd once supported the wrong emperor in a royal succession dispute. That emperor died. His rival, Lambert of Spoleto, eventually came to power, and so did his loyal supporter Stephen VI, who also became pope. Now, Stephen had a choice: move on or go full medieval petty. He chose petty, with enthusiasm. In 897, Pope Stephen ordered the body of Formosus exhumed from its grave in St. Peter's Basilica. Formosus had been dead for 9 months. That's not a typo. 9 months. His body was decayed, fragile, and, this is not a metaphor, propped up on a throne in a courtroom. He was dressed in full papal regalia. He was given a public defender. And he was put on trial. The charges? Perjury, violating church law, and, I kid you not, ambition. Apparently, Formosus had wanted to be pope too much. Which, to be fair, is a little rich coming from a guy who just propped a corpse on a chair to win an argument. The trial was grotesque. Witnesses were called. Arguments were made. The corpse, nicknamed the cadaver pope by later historians, sat there, slumped and slowly disintegrating. Some accounts claim that Stephen screamed at the body. Others say he demanded the defense attorney respond on Formosus's behalf. All of them agree it was extremely weird. Eventually, the court, shocker, found the deceased pope guilty. Stephen ordered the papal garments torn from the body. The 3 fingers Formosus had used for blessings were cut off. His corpse was dragged through the streets and dumped into the Tiber River. Because, nothing says righteous judgment like tossing your rival's remains into the local fish pond. And how did this go over in Rome? Badly. The public was horrified. Even by 9th century standards, putting a rotting pope on trial was seen as a bit much. Within months, Pope Stephen VI was arrested, imprisoned, and strangled to death in his cell. The corpse of Formosus was fished out of the river, reburied with honor, and posthumously pardoned by the next pope, who probably added "no trials for the dead" to the official rulebook. The Cadaver Synod remains one of the most morbid episodes in papal history, and a reminder that medieval power struggles had no limits. Not even death could stop the drama. So next time you think modern politics are grim, just remember the Pope who screamed at a corpse in front of a jury. Coming up, a Holy Roman Emperor who was so obsessed with the apocalypse, he tried to schedule it. Most rulers try to avoid disasters. Holy Roman Emperor Otto III wasn't most rulers. While most of Europe braced for the year 1000 like a medieval Y2K, with prayers, prophecies, and maybe a few underground bunkers, Otto looked at the looming apocalypse and thought, you know what? Let's make this a feature, not a bug. Born in 980, Otto III was practically raised on millennial anxiety. Medieval Europe was humming with apocalyptic vibes. Monks whispered about signs in the stars. Farmers saw every drought as divine foreshadowing. Somewhere, someone was definitely writing repent in Latin on a barn wall. Otto, meanwhile, had been crowned emperor by the age of 16. He was brilliant, dramatic, and deeply into religious symbolism. The kind of teenager who read Augustine for fun and thought empire management was a spiritual calling. Where other emperors conquered lands, Otto wanted to rebuild the Roman Empire, not with blood, but with vibes. He filled his court with scholars, theologians, and monks. He wore classical Roman robes. He renamed cities. He referred to himself as servant of the apostles, which sounds humble, but was basically medieval PR for I'm holier than you. And he had a plan. If the world was going to end around the year 1000, as many believed, Otto wanted to usher it in properly, not as a passive witness, but as the final emperor of Christian prophecy. You see, there was a widespread medieval belief that before the end of time, a great last emperor would rise, unite Christendom, restore justice, defeat evil, and then lay his crown at the feet of Christ. Otto read that prophecy and said, "That's me." He wasn't subtle about it. He made pilgrimages barefoot. He prayed obsessively. He tried to relocate the imperial capital to Rome. Not the chaotic medieval Rome of broken statues and bar brawls, but a spiritually cleansed Rome, worthy of divine history. He even installed a pope of his own, choosing a cousin, because nothing says holy destiny like a little nepotism. Meanwhile, everyone else in Europe was just panicking. Nobles were giving away land. Peasants confessed their sins. Astrologers had a nervous breakdown trying to read the stars through medieval fog. But Otto? He was rehearsing for a cosmic finale. And then, nothing happened. The year 1000 came and passed. No trumpet blasts. No second coming. Just more taxes, rain, and livestock drama. Otto, now in his early 20s, doubled down. He still believed the end was near. It had just been delayed. He tried to unify more territories. He punished corrupt bishops. He fasted constantly. His health began to fail. Then, in the year 1002, 2 years after the non-apocalypse, Otto died suddenly of fever. No grand finale. No divine coronation. Just a young emperor with a Roman soul and a calendar full of prophetic expectations. He was buried in a Roman-style tomb in Aachen, still wearing his crown, clutching relics, waiting, perhaps, for a cosmic curtain call that never came. Otto remains one of the most ambitious and oddly sincere rulers of the early Middle Ages. A man who didn't just fear the apocalypse, he wanted it, on schedule, preferably with dramatic music and perfect lighting. Coming up next, a royal who was technically dead, but people kept electing him to office anyway. Imagine you've died. Peacefully, we hope. You've been buried. Prayers have been said, and history has begun gently filing you away. But then, surprise, you're re-elected to office. Not once, but multiple times. Welcome to the utterly medieval, deeply bureaucratic afterlife of Pope Gregory IX, or, depending on the version, a few other unlucky souls who became known to history as the popes who wouldn't stay dead. Yes, this happened. Let's set the scene in the early 13th century. The papacy was at its most powerful. Popes weren't just religious leaders. They were international political players. Kings bowed to them. Armies marched for them. Excommunication was basically the nuclear button. And into this hotbed of spiritual drama came Gregory IX. A clever, fiery man known for battling heretics, writing volumes of church law, and declaring that black cats were suspiciously demonic. Yes, that's where that superstition partly comes from. But while Gregory died in 1241, the real story begins after. Due to intense political instability, and perhaps just a pinch of chaos, the papal court found itself indecisive. Over and over, different factions within the church couldn't agree on a new pope. The cardinals were locked in literal rooms, conclaves, for days, even weeks, hurling prayers and passive-aggressive psalms at each other. And so, in moments of desperation, someone would suggest bringing back Gregory. A figure everyone had agreed on. Someone already canonically approved. Someone, yes, inconveniently deceased, but who wouldn't object to a papal election because, well, worms don't vote. Now, to be clear, these weren't re-elections in the dig up the body and put it on the throne sense. This wasn't another cadaver synod. This was more bureaucratic. Gregory's name appeared again and again in documents, papal lists, and internal vote tallies. Sometimes as a candidate, occasionally as a placeholder pope. In some records, he was even credited with decisions made years after his death, as though Rome had decided, well, we're not getting anywhere. Might as well let the dead guy handle it. This odd clerical ghosting wasn't unique to Gregory. Throughout the Middle Ages, there are scattered references to deceased bishops, abbots, even monarchs being listed as still holding office, sometimes for years, because no one had agreed on their successor. The reasoning? Part politics, part superstition. Some saw it as a way to honor continuity. Others thought disrupting a holy office too quickly might anger God. A few, we suspect, were just trying to avoid conflict. After all, it's hard to argue with someone who's already in the afterlife. In Gregory's case, it took almost 2 years to elect his final successor, a record-setting delay that left the church rudderless, cardinals sleep-deprived, and at least one unlucky corpse renominated more times than any living candidate. And while this might seem absurd, there's something oddly poetic about it. The medieval world was obsessed with legacy, immortality, and divine continuity. To them, death wasn't the end of influence. It was just a change in management. So if you've ever had a job you couldn't escape, spare a thought for Pope Gregory IX. He wasn't just Pope in life. He was also Pope in death, papal purgatory, and posthumous paperwork limbo. Next time, a nobleman who lost everything because he wouldn't stop insulting ducks. Of all the ways to lose your lands, titles, and royal favor, you probably wouldn't expect defending a duck to top the list. And yet, in the courts of medieval Burgundy, that's exactly what happened to Lord Géraud of Montpensier, a man whose aristocratic career was undone by his very vocal disdain for waterfowl. To be fair, the story is a little more complicated than, quote, he yelled at a duck, but not by much. Géraud was a minor noble with big opinions. He was clever, literate, and, according to his contemporaries, utterly insufferable. The kind of man who corrected monks on Latin declensions, questioned the architecture of chapels he hadn't funded, and once described a bishop's sermon as intellectually offensive to the Almighty. In short, he made enemies. Fast. But what sealed his fate was an argument at the court of Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. The Duke, known for his love of ceremony, wine, and elaborate banquets, often held court in sprawling gardens filled with ornamental ponds and, of course, ducks, imported, pampered, and often hand-fed by noble ladies. One spring afternoon, as courtiers strolled through the gardens discussing diplomacy, embroidery, and whose tunic matched the drapes, Géraud reportedly stood beside the pond and began insulting the ducks, loudly. "They are vile beasts," he declared, gesturing with a goblet, "greedy, gluttonous, lacking in grace or discipline. Much like the nobility of Brittany," he added, just to ensure maximum offense. Now, on the surface, this was just another one of Géraud's monologues. But, unfortunately, one of the ducks in question had been gifted to the Duke by the Countess of Brittany, whose coat of arms, unfortunately, also featured ducks. Géraud had, essentially, just insulted a gift, an ally, and an entire heraldic tradition in one drunken outburst. The fallout was rapid. The Countess sent a strongly worded letter. The Duke's steward lodged a formal complaint. Rumor spread that Géraud had previously referred to a goose as more intelligent than half the clergy. Whether true or not, it was enough. Within a week, Géraud was stripped of his ceremonial duties. Within a month, his estate was audited for, quote, irregularities. By autumn, he was politely invited to retire to a distant abbey, one famously devoid of ponds. Historians still debate whether the ducks were merely the final straw in a long line of offenses. But in the preserved court records of Burgundy, Géraud's case is listed under a peculiar accusation: conduct unbecoming of a gentleman at table and pond. Centuries later, his story became a favorite among court jesters and playwrights, who immortalized him as the man who quacked back. One particularly cheeky minstrel even performed a song titled "The Ballad of the Bird-Brained Baron," which may or may not have caused a second round of family disgrace. There's a moral in here somewhere. Perhaps it's about diplomacy, or the importance of staying sober around birds. But mostly, it's this. In the medieval world, power could be lost, not just through war, betrayal, or scandal, but because you insulted the wrong duck in front of the wrong duke. Coming up next, a queen who kept a notebook of every insult ever said about her and made sure none of them went unpunished. In the grand halls of Renaissance Spain, among tapestries, velvet, and the quiet rustle of political schemes, there sat a queen who did something extraordinary and, frankly, quite relatable. She kept a notebook, not of prayers, not of poetry, but of every insult ever said about her. Her name was Isabella of Portugal, queen consort to Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and one of the most powerful women in Europe during the early 1500s. Elegant, reserved, and politically sharp, Isabella mastered the fine art of royal diplomacy and the even finer art of grudge-holding. At court, she was admired for her beauty, her calm demeanor, and her fashion sense. But behind the scenes, Isabella had a secret, a personal journal meticulously written in her own hand, chronicling every comment, snub, or sideways glance that suggested anything less than absolute admiration. One servant supposedly made a joke about her elaborate headwear. Into the book it went. A noblewoman referred to her as a little cold, noted. A bishop once coughed during her entrance into the chapel, highly suspicious. Now, you might think this was a kind of diary, perhaps a place to vent. But Isabella didn't just write these things down. She acted on them. Over the years, many of the individuals listed in the insult ledger, as it became known in court gossip, found themselves mysteriously reassigned, passed over for promotion, or, in one dramatic case, quietly exiled to a post managing grain shipments in rural Andalusia. A noblewoman who once questioned Isabella's Spanish accent ended up married to a widower with 5 children and a vineyard that produced sour wine. Coincidence? Perhaps. But palace staff learned quickly. Say nothing. Compliment the embroidery. Always smile. And Isabella was discreet. She never shouted, never publicly rebuked. She simply remembered and waited, sometimes for years. When her husband, Emperor Charles V, left her in charge during his absences, Isabella ruled with grace and efficiency and kept careful track of who respected her and who didn't. An ambassador once addressed her as the Emperor's wife instead of Her Majesty Queen Regent. He was rerouted to Lisbon via donkey and rainstorm. This blend of calm leadership and ironclad memory earned her a reputation as both saintly and slightly terrifying. Even her enemies admitted she was fair. But exactly fair. No more, no less. If you gave her trouble in 1532, don't expect an invitation to the midsummer feast of 1539. And the best part? The notebook survived. Discovered centuries later in a dusty archive in Seville, Isabella's revenge register, as historians cheekily call it, remains a fascinating document. A mix of daily notes, formal complaints, and remarkably detailed entries like March 17th. Duchess Leonore again speaks with tone. Third offense. Smells of clove. Today, scholars debate whether Isabella meant it all seriously or whether it was part performance, a silent assertion of power in a male-dominated court. But either way, it worked. Because sometimes ruling a kingdom means patience, and sometimes it means quietly rewriting the guest list. Next, a crown prince who loved astrology so much he governed based on horoscopes, and once postponed a siege because Mercury was in retrograde. Once upon a time, in the courts of early 15th century Bohemia, the fate of entire armies, peace treaties, and royal marriages all hinged on one thing: the stars. This was the domain of Wenceslaus IV, King of Bohemia, and technically Holy Roman Emperor, though he wore that crown like someone who forgot it was laundry day. While other monarchs studied battlefield tactics or foreign policy, Wenceslaus had a different advisor, his court astrologer, and not in a "what's my lucky number" kind of way. Wenceslaus ran his court, and occasionally the empire, by horoscope. His obsession with the zodiac was legendary. Each morning, before any royal decree, he would consult his charts. War councils scheduled? Not if the moon was in Capricorn. Tax laws to discuss? Mars is square Saturn postponed. At one point, he delayed the siege of a rebellious town for 3 weeks because Venus was in opposition and he feared bad vibes. His generals were not thrilled. Majesty, one reportedly said, "They have cannons. We have crabs in the 4th house." Wenceslas remained unmoved. "No action until Aries returns to favor," he declared, polishing his opal ring for protection. Now, to be fair, astrology wasn't some fringe belief in medieval Europe. Many educated people, including scientists and doctors, saw it as a legitimate tool. Charts were used to time surgeries, pick wedding dates, and diagnose fevers. But Wenceslas took it further. He wore clothing aligned with planetary hours. He redesigned his palace chambers to reflect celestial geometry, and once, when a comet appeared in the sky, he canceled court for a week and hid under his bed. With incense, his astrologer, a man named Nicholas of Mulhausen, wielded near unchecked influence. Noble families began bribing Nicholas not with money, but with favorable chart readings. If you could get him to write, "Mercury favors the House of Za" in the margins, your lands were safe for another year. Things reached a tipping point during what historians now call the Zodiac Siege. A rebellious Bohemian town had refused to pay taxes. Wenceslas ordered it surrounded. But then, as troops lined up, he halted the assault, because Mercury was retrograde, and attacking under such conditions would bring dishonor, crop blight, and possibly soggy boots. The rebels, sensing opportunity, launched a counterattack. Wenceslas fled. The siege was lost. But in his defense, the moon was waning. Eventually, even the Holy Roman electors, famously patient with royal eccentricity, had had enough. They deposed Wenceslas. Quietly, politely. He barely noticed. He spent his later years in a castle tower with his star maps, still convinced he was destined to reign again once Jupiter completed its celestial cycle. Spoiler, he didn't. But perhaps the most ironic twist. His death, in 1419, came on a day his charts predicted as, quote, auspicious for personal growth. He was drinking wine in his bath. So if you've ever blamed Mercury retrograde for your bad week, just remember, once it cost a kingdom. Next up, a noblewoman who won a castle siege, using nothing but cheese, bread, and an extremely sassy bluff. Medieval sieges were brutal, long, boring, exhausting stalemates where armies camped outside city walls, waiting for hunger or disease to do the work. Most ended in surrender, not swords. But once, just once, a castle won a siege not with fire or steel, but with cheese. Our heroine, Countess Jeanne de Belleville, a noblewoman from 14th century France, with a sharp tongue, sharper instincts, and a pantry full of attitude. It started with a siege at her family's castle in western Brittany. The exact reason is lost in a tangle of inheritance disputes, political alliances, and probably someone being rude at a banquet. But the result was the same. Royal troops surrounded her stronghold and demanded she surrender. Jeanne's husband was away. Her sons were young. The garrison was small. Logic said, give up. But Jane said, let's have lunch. She ordered her servants to prepare an extravagant meal on the battlements, full view of the besieging soldiers. Tables were set with linen cloth, bread was sliced, wine poured, and a massive wheel of cheese brought up as the centerpiece. Then, as trumpets blared from the enemy camp demanding surrender, Jean lifted the cheese in both hands, turned toward the army, and shouted something along the lines of, "If this is famine, may it last forever." Then she and her garrison calmly sat down and ate. The stunned soldiers, already weeks into a boring siege, began to doubt. Was the castle actually well stocked? Had they misjudged? Would this drag on for months while they slowly starved in the mud? They waited a few more days. Jeanne had another feast, this time tossing leftover crusts from the walls like offerings to peasant gods. Morale plummeted in the camp. Eventually, the attackers, cold, hungry, humiliated, packed up and left. And Jeanne, she didn't just survive, she thrived. Later in life, after her husband was killed by a rival faction, she became a legendary privateer, commanding ships along the coast, attacking French vessels, and earning the nickname the Lioness of Brittany. But even in her piratical career, she remained famous for the cheese bluff of Belleville, the moment she turned dairy into diplomacy. The tale became so popular that other castles tried it. Some staged fake banquets with rotten food. One bold baron stuffed sacks with leaves and called them emergency hams. None worked quite as well as Jeanne's original performance, mostly because no one else could sell it with such queenly flair. Historians have debated whether it really happened. Was it cheese, or a fattened goose, or just exaggerated poetry? But the story endured because people loved it. In an age of grim battles, plagues, and endless crusades, the idea of winning with wit instead of weapons was simply too satisfying to forget. So the next time someone tells you to take things seriously, that war requires only strength and strategy, tell them the tale of the countess who ended a siege by serving snacks on a wall. Coming up next, the king who outlawed shoes not for fun, but because he couldn't handle his nobles' ankles. Once upon a time, in the courts of medieval France, a king stood up, cleared his throat, and announced that shoes were henceforth banned. Not all shoes, mind you, but pointy ones. The kind that revealed ankles. The kind that made noblemen look a little too fashionable. Welcome to the bizarre world of King Charles VI, also known, with unfortunate accuracy, as Charles the Mad. To be fair, Charles had a rough life. He came to the throne in 1380 at just 11 years old, inherited a realm crawling with scheming uncles, and was expected to navigate the 100 Years' War, famine, economic collapse, and an extremely dramatic cousin in Burgundy. But by his mid-20s, things got strange. Charles began to suffer from episodes. What modern historians think may have been a mix of schizophrenia and severe bipolar disorder. He'd have lucid periods, then plunge into madness, forgetting who he was, refusing to bathe, or running through the palace screaming that he was made of glass. And then, during one of his calmer phases, he noticed something horrifying. Shoes. Specifically, poulaines. The long, pointed shoes worn by fashionable young nobles. These shoes were extravagant, sometimes up to 24 inches long, curled at the tip, stuffed with moss and decorated with embroidery. They were the Crocs with socks of their day, ugly, controversial, and unreasonably popular. To Charles, they were a symbol of moral decay. He declared them indecent. He said they corrupted the soul. He claimed that visible male ankles were driving the court into sin and vanity. And so, he outlawed them. His new decree demanded that all shoes be blunt-toed, ankle-covering, and, if possible, dull. He even commissioned royal inspectors to patrol court events and measure shoe length. Nobles caught violating the toe laws were fined, publicly shamed, or forced to donate their fashion-forward footwear to the church, where it was ceremonially destroyed. By monks. It sounds absurd, and it was. But the real irony? Charles himself often forgot his own laws during his mental breaks. There are records of him walking barefoot through the palace, convinced he was made of glass, asking courtiers not to touch him for fear he'd shatter. One time he demanded all mirrors be removed from the royal chambers, then tripped over a fallen tapestry and insisted the rug was possessed. Meanwhile, noblemen snuck their poulaines into private parties, hiding them under robes and blaming old injuries when asked about their odd gait. The ban didn't last. As Charles's grip on reality faded, enforcement fell apart. By the time his rival, the Duke of Burgundy, arrived at court in a full velvet outfit with pearl-tipped poulaines, no one dared object. But for a brief, glorious moment, France had a footwear inquisition, and the royal court learned a valuable lesson: never underestimate the madness of kings, or the power of really controversial shoes. So ends our journey through royal drama, petty power, and medieval absurdity. From duck duels to revenge notebooks, exploding pajamas to celestial warfare, one thing's clear: history was never boring. It just wore better outfits. And so we drift away from the banquets and battlements, leaving behind our monarchs and madmen, their golden thrones and cheese-fueled standoffs. If there's a theme in these tales, it's not just power, but how strangely human it all was. These weren't flawless legends or marble statues. They were people. Petulant, proud, ridiculous, brilliant. Some governed with vision. Others ruled by horoscope. A few talked to ducks. One screamed at a corpse. And somehow, despite the blunders and barefoot kings, history moved forward. Castles were built, borders redrawn, and the modern world took shape, one bizarre royal tantrum at a time. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine those candlelit halls and echoing throne rooms. And perhaps in some quiet corner of the dreaming mind, a duck still waddles proudly across a battlefield, unbothered by politics and perfectly pointy shoes. Sleep well, dear listener, and remember, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does occasionally wear velvet slippers.